So my goal this morning is to connect Matthew 2 to a new and immediate ministry opportunity which has come to NPC. And that opportunity, bottom line up front, is as a church family to undertake to care for up to 15 Afghan refugees over the next 90 days. And I'm going to explain a little bit about how it has come to NPC that we've been invited to play a servant leader role in this. This is how the opportunity came about. A long time ago, our children's ministry director, Elizabeth Deacon, was looking for an opportunity to engage young children in missional thinking during Advent. And that is how the year-over-year Operation Christmas Child Shoebox Ministry came about. To capture a teachable moment for young children at a time when they were thinking about receiving gifts, to then think about being gift givers, and to think about being gift givers in a way that was missional towards other people. So what that's done for us is it has led to a relationship with Samaritan's Purse, which is the missions agency that does the actual delivery of the shoeboxes to children around the world. And we've had this relationship over a long period of time. Where this gets us to is John Haldeman, one of our deacons, who you'll see up front in just a moment, retiring and looking for a way to invest some more of his time in kingdom work. And what John decided to do was to volunteer with Samaritan's Purse, same agency, and to become involved with the shoebox ministry. So flash forward to August 2021, or backwards, I don't know, forward or backward, flash some way, to August 2021, and to the news reports coming out of Afghanistan, and to the takeover of Afghanistan by the Taliban, and to everything that unfolded at that moment in the summer. John and I were talking, and I asked him, I said, hey, John, check and see if there are any hands-on ways that NPC could be involved with refugees. There are some refugee agencies in Columbus, for instance, that I'd connected with in the past, and John looked into it, and nothing was immediately apparent at that point in time. There were no immediate opportunities, and so time went on until last week when I got a text from John that said, we need to talk. Now, if you're a pastor, these are usually ominous text messages to receive. Usually people don't text, we need to talk, and then take you out to celebrate you. And so I nervously called John, and John shared that Samaritan's Purse had reached out to him with this exact kind of opportunity, hands-on opportunity to support Afghan refugees in a nutshell. And you can find out all kinds of information from John and from others. There are, we hear 60,000 or so State Department vetted Afghan refugees in our country, many of whom are living in temporary housing on U.S. military bases. Now, these refugees are free to go. They're free to wander about America and to start their lives whenever they want. But if we could only imagine being a refugee and what it would be like, where would you start? If you didn't have a place to land, if you didn't have connections, if you were in America, if it was all new to you, where would you start? And so the typical, customary refugee resettlement nonprofits have been overwhelmed by the need. And this led the government to reach out to Samaritan's Purse. See, it all comes back to Elizabeth Deacon and to the shoeboxes. And to reach out to Samaritan's Purse and to say, hey, Samaritan's Purse, can you help recruit churches to help us support in the resettlement of these refugees? And so what happened is John presented this opportunity to me, and we said, well, this lines up a lot with what we were talking about in August. And John and Samaritan's Purse drafted up a proposal for the session, the elders of our church, and the elders enthusiastically endorsed this opportunity. The reality is there's no way that this works except that Jesus is in charge. There's no way that this works except that we're dependent upon Jesus to walk with us through this, because this can't be a small group of people project, one little team working on refugee things. It has to be an all-in church project. None of us, I don't think, if you are, we'd love to talk to you. None of us are experts in resettling refugees. None of us are experts in Afghan culture. If you speak Dari or Pashto, we'd love to talk with you after church. And there are all kinds of reasons why this shouldn't work. Except that we have a great king who wants his people to love people. And we have an opportunity to follow him and to have our faith stretched and built during this time. And after I hung up with John, I reflected that there are all kinds of good, solid Bible reasons for saying yes to Samaritan Purse's request, but one reason connects to the heart of Advent and to Christmas. And that is what I want to unpack for us this morning, just in a moment. And that is that God's Son, Jesus, became a refugee in order to provide refuge for people who needed grace. That woven into what we remember, particularly during this season, is the fact that Jesus became a refugee. And not by accident. But Jesus' becoming a refugee, as Matthew reports it in chapter 2, is part of God's plan to bring the gospel to us. So if you are a Christian, part of your hope is woven into Jesus becoming a refugee. And I will explain that for us in a moment. If you're not a Christian, then this is a very, very good morning for you to be here, because Jesus is becoming a refugee in order to do gospel work on our behalf, holds out to us a great picture of the gospel. And so what I want to do is look at these passages from Matthew just in 2 points, focusing on the rest of the story, really what happens as Matthew tells it after the Magi leave Bethlehem. So you remember the story of the wise men come, they bring their gifts to Jesus and to Mary, and they worship him, and then they leave. And that's usually where we drop the story. But the story unfolds more in chapter 2 and verse 13, where we read about God's Son becoming a refugee to give us a fresh start. So if you have a Bible, look at verse 13 of Matthew 2 with me. The Magi have come, they've given their gifts, they've worshiped Jesus, and now they're leaving. Now when they had departed, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, "Rise, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him." And he rose and took the child and his mother by night and departed to Egypt. There's a lot just in those verses. You're a young dad. Some of you here are young dads. Some of you here are young moms. You have young children. You can wonder, what would it be like in the middle of the night to pack up everything that you could carry and head to a foreign country? What would it be like? A couple of observations. Herod is, at this point, about 69 years old. He is a friend of the Roman emperor. He's been king for 34 years, and Herod is a survivor. He is a survivor of political intrigue. He's a survivor of assassination attempts. He is, at this point in his life, more obsessed with his legacy than your typical college football coach. He is so obsessed with his legacy that he has, at different points along the way, executed 3 of his sons for different reasons, and he's rewritten his will 6 times. He is very concerned about life after Herod. And the idea that there would be a rival king born is a huge threat to him. So that is Herod's world. As we read in the story, God the Father is sovereignly keeping his eye on Joseph and Mary and Jesus, and he warns them through the angel. He sends them to Egypt. My study Bible note says that Egypt, the border, is about 90 miles from Bethlehem. So, just a little bit shorter than the drive from Columbus to Cincinnati for a frame of reference. This is the distance that the Holy Family needs to travel. And Egypt might have been close on a map, but it was a world away in an Israelite's mind. That all throughout the Bible, Egypt as a place represents badness, if you will. Egypt was where Israel was enslaved. Egypt is from where God led Israel to freedom. And throughout the rest of the Old Testament, as you've become familiar with it or will become familiar with it, you see that Israel's relationship to Egypt is always fraught with difficulty. Sometimes in Israel's darkest moments, they form alliances with Egypt that aren't good or right. So to go from Israel to Egypt is not a neutral thing, really. It's a big deal for God to send Joseph and Mary and Jesus to say, look, you're going to be safer in Egypt than you will be in Bethlehem. That's a substantive statement. During Advent, we contemplate the humility of God's Son becoming incarnate in the person of Jesus. Specifically, our confession puts it this way: in his conception and birth, he humbled himself, in that being from all eternity the Son of God in the bosom of the Father, he was pleased in the fullness of time to become the Son of Man, made of a woman of low estate, and to be born of her with diverse circumstances of more than ordinary abasement. End quote. Diverse circumstances of more than ordinary abasement. It is a quaint way to describe being born in a barn, greeted by shepherds, hunted by an evil king, forced into refugee status. Jesus' refugee status did not rob him of any worth and dignity, did it? He didn't become less important by becoming a refugee. It didn't cost him value or dignity. Not having been a refugee, I could imagine that as a refugee, one might feel less dignified. I think it was just today, Kim sent me a op-ed written by Khalid Husseini, who wrote The Kite Runner. Maybe you've had to read The Kite Runner at some point in your life, or you chose to. It's an interesting book. He talks about being a refugee from Afghanistan in 79-80, and how in the process of coming to America, and in restarting a life as a refugee, coming out of a life from where his family was well settled, well established, had excellent jobs and excellent prospects for a future, to coming back and starting over with nothing. You might understand how that could lead a person to feel less dignified or less worthy. It certainly was not the case for Jesus, that he lost any dignity as a refugee. And if we have the chance over the next months to interact with refugees, if this plan continues to come to fruition, it'll be important for us to remember that Jesus, in his experience of life as a refugee, dignified it. That he dignified life as a refugee. Joseph rose and took the child and his mother by night and departed to Egypt and remained there until the death of Herod. The probability is their time as refugees in Egypt was about a year, more or less. We can't be super precise on the dates, but for about a year, Joseph and Mary and Jesus lived in Egypt as refugees. And I've heard people speculate, isn't it great that Joseph and Mary had the gifts from the Magi to financially sustain them during their time in Egypt? And it certainly is good providence, right? That they have these gifts, they have some cash to travel to Egypt. Better to be safe in Egypt than dead in Bethlehem. But I doubt that they thought it was great. Thinking about it this week, Joseph and Mary were engaged before the incarnation, right? Like they had plans for their life before the angel showed up to tell Mary that she was going to become pregnant with the Son of God. There were other things that they hoped to do. Being refugees in Egypt could not have been on the list. Could not have been what they dreamed would be in their young married life. I mean, put yourself in the shoes of parents of a toddler. I mean, most of our young parenting was spent far away from grandparents, different states, sometimes, multiple days travel away. And so just, when the grandparents would show up to visit the grandkids, and us a little bit, but mostly the grandkids, it was great because they'd say, hey, we're going to take the grandkids for a little while, and you and Kim can do something, which usually involved napping. But they meant, that's what happened. And Joseph and Mary don't have that. They don't have a family network. Think about being a young mom and all the questions that young moms have as they are first-time moms. Who do they ask? Well, they usually ask their mom. Mary doesn't have that. What kind of work does Joseph do? I mean, we know that he's a carpenter. What kind of work did he pick up in Egypt to sustain the family? He didn't have his shop. Did he keep working as a carpenter? Did he have to take whatever work came his way? He was an outsider. He was a Jewish man in the Egyptian world. Jesus, 2-3 years old. Family eats weird food compared to the Egyptians, right? Might be picking up some of the language, but would speak it with an accent. Doesn't fit in with the other kids. 3-year-old Jesus playing in Egypt. Astonishingly, Matthew tells us that becoming refugees was not just something that happened to Joseph, Mary, and Jesus. It wasn't just a circumstance that unfolded, not just a hardship, that God's Son becoming a refugee was actually according to God's plan. Matthew makes this connection by quoting Hosea 11 and verse 1. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, out of Egypt I called my son. So Hosea is one of the Old Testament prophets, and he's describing this moment where God delivered Israel from slavery in Egypt to the promised land, that God had set his affection on Israel and had brought Israel from slavery to freedom. And Matthew applies Hosea 11:1 to Jesus. And actually what is happening here, and you'll have to work this out a little bit later if you want to, is Matthew is setting up how Jesus in his life recapitulates the life of Israel. So Israel was enslaved in Egypt, and God sets them free, and they move from Egypt to the promised land. But if you remember it, at all the story from the Old Testament, what was that journey like for Israel out of Egypt? Was it easy or hard? It was hard. Did they have a great attitude or a bad attitude? Most of them, they had a bad attitude. Did they worship God wholeheartedly, or did they make a golden calf? They made a golden calf. Were they super happy with the manna that was provided, or did they grumble? They grumbled. Basically, God set them free from Egypt to bring them to slavery, and they complained the whole time, such that they spent 40 years in the desert complaining and not learning the lesson. I mean, if you follow a map of the wilderness journey of Israel from Egypt to the Promised Land, it's not like a straight line, like they got, took them a really, really long time. They just kept wandering in circles. It looks like the worst Uber ride ever. They're just going around and around and around, and they're not getting there. Jesus goes to Egypt according to the plan of God, so that when he comes from Egypt back to Israel, he is recapitulating sinlessly what Israel did sinfully. That he does correctly what God's people should have done correctly before. Which is why when you get to the story of Jesus' temptation by Satan in the wilderness, what Jesus is doing there, among other things, is he is recapitulating and he is obeying where Israel failed. The gospel point is this, that in God's design, Jesus needs to go and do perfectly what God's people mess up all the time. And he does this on behalf not just of Israel back then, but he does this on behalf of us. That we are the kinds of people who grumble. We are the kinds of people who complain. We are the kinds of people who take what the Lord provides and say, no, thank you. We'd rather have something else. Thank you for delivering us from freedom. What else can you do? Jesus doesn't do that, which sets him up for the great gospel work where his obedience, his perfect life, counts for my sinful life. So that his non-complaining counts for my complaining. That his not giving into temptation counts for all the times that I do give into temptation. So that he can go to the cross and be a perfect substitute for me. And in God's economy, this requires him to be a refugee. So that he can go to Egypt and God can call him out. Out of Egypt, I have called my son. By God's design, Jesus was a refugee in Egypt. And God the Father had his eye on him. And he loved him very much. And he watched over him. And he had a great purpose for his refugee son. And we see that purpose become more plain in verses 16 to 22, where Matthew describes events that unfold while Jesus was a refugee. Now, I will be honest with you, I have never heard these verses preached before. It's possible that I was in a church where they were preached before and I just didn't pay attention, so I want to be fair. Sometimes sermons make one sleepy. The soothing voice of the pastor. The late Saturday night. But I've never heard these verses explained that God's Son became a refugee to give real hope to people who are distraught. So look at Matthew 2, verse 16. These are hard verses. Then Herod, when he saw that he had been tricked by the wise man, became furious. I'll bet he did. And he sent and killed all the male children in Bethlehem in all that region who were 2 years old and under, according to the time that he had ascertained from the wise men. Then was fulfilled what was spoken by the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and loud lamentation. Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be comforted because they are no more. This is a horrible story. It's the stuff of nightmares. It's when you see evil like this break out into the world, it's hard to look and it's hard to not look. Look at verse 18. The quote from Jeremiah. And what Matthew is doing here is quoting from Jeremiah and from Jeremiah chapter 31. So chapter 31 is an important address in the Bible. Jeremiah 31 is actually one of the great passages in all of the Old Testament. It's a passage that's filled with great news. Jeremiah 31 is the passage in which God makes a new covenant promise in order to save his people. We don't have time to completely unpack it, but let me just read a few verses starting in verse 33, where God says, I will put my law within them, I will write it on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. And no longer shall each one teach his neighbor and each his brother, saying, Know the Lord, for they shall know me from the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord. For I will forgive their iniquity, and I will remember their sin no more. It's a great chapter from beginning to end, except for one verse. The verse that Matthew quotes. Verse 15 of Jeremiah 31. In Jeremiah's day, listeners would have known too well the sound of a mother's grief over children lost to war or to exile. And in Jeremiah's day, God said, I see that grief. I count that grief. That grief is not lost on me. I'm actually going to do something. I'm going to do something better. I'm going to do a new thing. I'm going to do the new covenant work where I am going to do something in history to bring hope to distraught people. And that is why I think Matthew quotes Jeremiah. Herod's action is transparently evil. Matthew doesn't need a Bible verse to tell us that parents are sad when bad things happen to their kids. He doesn't need to proof text that. He doesn't need to reach back to the Old Testament. We'll see if I can find a Bible verse to prove that parents should be sad. He doesn't need to do that. So what is he doing? Well, what he's actually doing is he's pointing to the fact that in the midst of this sadness, in the midst of this horror, in the midst of this tragedy, God is doing a new thing. You see, Herod thinks that if he can eliminate 2 years worth of rivals, he can make his kingdom strong. In other words, that the death of a few sons, in Herod's twisted thinking, the death of a few sons is okay as long as evil remains in power. But God actually is doing exactly the opposite. He's actually setting up human history to bring it to the point where the death of one son is going to be okay in order to crush evil. That he's going to send one son. Herod's like, if I can eliminate all the sons from Bethlehem, then it will be okay. And God said, I'm going to send one son from Bethlehem. It's going to make things right. He has to be a refugee first. And he's going to come from Egypt to put into operation the new covenant promise. This is how God is going to bring hope to the distraught. Out of this great evil done by a horrible man, God's real king will emerge, whose great good life will result in changed hearts, forgiveness of sins, the new covenant. Herod thinks a bunch of sons need to die to save his legacy. God's plan is just for one son to die to save all of his people. And this plan requires Jesus to go to Egypt and come back, so that we get down to verse 19. But when Herod died, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, saying, Rise, take the child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel, for those who sought the child's life are dead. And he rose and took the child and his mother and went to the land of Israel. Christian, all of our hope in the gospel ties in to the work of this son who for a period of time was a refugee on our behalf. On our behalf. He became a refugee in order to save many. So what does this mean for the ministry opportunity that is ahead of us? Well, we are people whose life has been changed by one refugee. And out of great love for him, we have an opportunity to serve people in our lives in all ways, shapes, or forms. But for a moment, for a day or for a few weeks or months longer, we don't know, we get to be the hands and feet of the refugee king. We get to be the hands and feet of the refugee king to other people who are actually living through an experience that most of us can't get our minds and hearts around. And John is going to come in a moment, and he's going to explain some of the opportunities that are before us, because this is a rapidly evolving ministry opportunity. You know, we don't have like a month to think about whether we want to do this or not, and then multiple years to plan how to do it. This is going to require us to respond immediately. And it's easy, for instance, to daydream about all kinds of good outcomes, the ways that we would write the end of the story. But we need to hold on loosely to all of any expectation that we would have about where this goes in the next 90 days or year or whatever. We're just here to serve the king. That's what we're doing. Jesus is writing everyone's story. We're not. Most of us haven't been refugees, which means that we will all make mistakes in this process. But you know when someone loves you. And love covers a multitude of sins. So we will make mistakes. Love covers a multitude of sins. And we might ask ourselves, well, what would happen if we end up giving away time and talent and money, all of everyone who gets to be involved in different ways? What if we undertake substantively to invest in people's lives who resettle in Columbus, and then as a result of resettling in Columbus, life goes on and they make decisions and go on a path and they forget that we ever helped them? That's completely okay. That's the way ministry is. That's what ministry is. You step in and you serve, and sometimes relationships last a long time, and sometimes relationships don't last a long time. The reality is that we're here to serve Jesus. And if the story were to end up like helping someone in 90 days get resettled and start their new life, and then you could imagine perhaps that they might resettle their life and move onward, what's the lesson for us? Well, what the lesson for us is, we get to learn a little bit more about how God loves us. Because that's really what Christmas is about, right? The Christmas is about the light which gives light to everyone coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to his own, but his own people did not receive him. But to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of God, will of man, but of God. This is the opportunity that's before us. We serve the King.